couple. Let's give it just a couple minutes to see if people join.
Okay.
Uh, yeah, it's good to see you all over real media.
Well,
It's good. There's interest in this.
yeah, the so many of the other humanitarian groups are really, very, very wary of speaking out right now because um, they're fearful they may be targeted for retribution. They are worried that, some of them, there is language in some of the letters that have gone out that uh, instruct them not to talk about the cuts. So yeah, everyone's just very nervous, and because we don't take U.S. government funding, we are a lot. Uh, we just have a lot more latitude to speak openly about what we're seeing.
No, and thank you for speaking with me. Let's give it maybe 30 more seconds to let a few more people
Sure.
join, figure
Okay.
more join as we go. But yeah, I was thinking, and I'm happy to say this publicly, and if you're a recently laid off USAID staffer or contractor, I'd love to hear from you. I want to just put together maybe 5 stories where people answer very simple questions. What do they do? What does that mean in layperson's terms? And why is it important? Because
Yeah.
I feel like there is like this mystery surrounding what happens at USAID, and kind of demystifying, I think is important going forward.
Yeah. No,
Uh,
I it is from the outside a uh, it can look like sort of a black box. I can assure you it is made of real humans who are working hard and trying to do the best they can.
yeah. So let's begin. So we'll do this. We're live. So welcome everyone. My name is Mark Leon Goldberg. I am the editor in chief of UN Dispatch, and I run Global Dispatches, the Substack, and the podcast. And this is a live recording of Global Dispatches on the Substack app. And Jeremy, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Jeremy Konyndyk. I'm the president of Refugees International and a former official at USAID in the Biden and Obama administration.
A very senior official, and we'll get into that later in this conversation. So, Jeremy, to kick off, can I have you just walk us through the events of the last 8 days? What has the Trump administration done with U.S. foreign aid and with USAID? Just take us through these events.
So I think at a macro level, the things that we've seen over the past little more than a week now, if they are continued for several more months, much less for the next few years, they really threaten to crash U.S. foreign assistance as we know it. And um, and that may be the point. I mean, there are a number of people who have been brought into the administration who have in the past written about the entire foreign aid industry and the entire U.S. foreign assistance apparatus being irredeemably compromised and full of woke agendas and all of this. And so that may be what they are seeking to do. Certainly, nothing we've seen would be inconsistent with the idea that part of the intent here is to crash a lot of the existing apparatus. I hope that's not what's going on, but we shall see. So what they've done uh, in Project 2025, there was an entire chapter on USAID written by Max Primorak, who was an official at USAID during the first Trump administration. Um, a lot of that, there's some good stuff in there. There's some good things about global health. There's some good things about localization. There is also a lot of things that I would fervently disagree with, particularly around uh, family planning and sexual and reproductive health, around the environment and climate issues. But there's nothing in there about uh, a forcible stop work for the first 3 months of the administration. But that's what they've done. So they came in on day one. The president issued an executive order calling for a comprehensive top to bottom review of all foreign assistance. Okay, on some level, fair enough. That's the prerogative of any administration. However, the way the State Department then a few days later sought to implement that was by issuing a global stop work order on all foreign assistance activities around the world, with just a few narrow exceptions for emergency food aid and for foreign military financing for Israel and Egypt. Um, there were a few other administrative exemptions, but not really material to most aid programs. So that is a shutdown for 3 months of all foreign activities, and not just a we won't give you any more money beyond what you already have. It was a stop everything you are doing for 3 months until we can ensure that you are not, I don't know, working to help the climate, or having a whatever a woke agenda means in foreign aid terms. Um, and so this is not going in with a scalpel to take out the things they don't like. This is crashing the plane, um, to ensure that uh, you know I, this is like crashing the plane because they don't like where it's headed. I mean, that is what they are doing. And for a lot of foreign aid organizations, for large U.S. partners, if they are cut off from their largest source of funding for 3 months, that's not something where you can just toggle an organization off for 3 months and then toggle them back on again. This will start to bankrupt organizations. It's already been forcing organizations to begin laying off staff. It has resulted in programs being shut down. Um, One of the things that is being affected by this has been PEPFAR programs. So I
Yeah.
was hearing
That,
yesterday from colleagues that people are being turned away from AIDS clinics in Africa.
yeah, PEPFAR is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, a Bush administration era program that's done a remarkable job providing antiretrovirals and other AIDS interventions, saving an estimated 25 million lives. I want to get into that in a moment. Can I have you speak specifically what's happening right now at USAID? You were a former senior official at USAID in the Obama administration running the humanitarian assistance programs at USAID. What are you hearing from some of your former colleagues? As far as I can tell, like most of USAID staff and many contractors, if not most, are being like laid off, it sounds like.
So there is a lot of fear at USAID right now. On Monday, at the end of the day, Monday, a pretty substantial number. I've heard estimates around 60%. Most of the estimates I've heard are around 60 people at a senior leadership level across numerous parts of the agency were put on involuntary administrative leave. And this included the senior leaders of many of the bureaus across the agency. It included a substantial number of the attorneys in the general counsel's office, including the lead attorney and the ethics attorneys. It's never a good sign when you're getting rid of the ethics attorney. Um, and and then a note went around to all staff the next day saying that there was suspicion that some people had been circumventing the president's agenda, and so they had decided to put all of these people on administrative leave. Now, I highly doubt that 60 people were simultaneously circumventing the president's agenda. I don't know what the new leadership were reacting to, but again, like with the freeze order, it shows just a generalized mistrust and suspicion towards the entire building, towards the entire apparatus, and a presumption that it is better to shut the whole thing down than to go in and just take out the parts you don't like. Then the next day, so yesterday on Tuesday, they went and fired and furloughed all of the institutional service contractors who work for USAID, or nearly all of them.
And it's worth pointing out that, USAID itself has like a relatively small footprint. Most of the work done around the world is done by contractors on behalf of USAID. These
and partners, yes.
kind of like contractors in the Beltway, or it could be NGOs or even like local NGOs working around the world. But USAID itself has like a small staff. Most of like the actual impact of what USAID does is funded through contractors, to either for-profit or nonprofit contractors. And all these guys had their contracts more or less frozen.
Correct. And so they're going after the money, and they've paused all that. They're now also going after the workforce at USAID. So, and this gets a bit esoteric for a moment, but indulge me. USAID has long had a cap imposed by Congress on how many official government employees they can hire. And so as their workload has grown, as their funding has grown, and has outpaced their staff, they have ended up contracting out a lot of the just basic functions of USAID. So when I worked at USAID, maybe half the people in the office would be these institutional contractors who would be doing things like everything from providing administrative support to providing pretty high-end technical input to program design and things like that. They are really integrated into the workforce. And for whatever reason, in their wisdom, the new team sent them all home. In the Global Health Bureau, they fired them all. They all got abrupt letters of termination yesterday, and that's about half the workforce of the Bureau. In the Humanitarian Bureau, they were furloughed, not fired, and there it's about 40%. And in that bureau, they're doing things like doing all the travel support for the disaster response teams that need to move around the world, doing the processing of grants. So really, without these people, the agency breaks. And I don't know if that was known or understood as the intent, but it is the effect of these kind of things. And that in turn means that programs break. So, um, the output of all this is that the way that the United States shows up in the world, the good that we are able to do in the world through our foreign aid programs, whether that is enabling people living with HIV to keep their infection suppressed so that we can control the epidemic and they can live their lives, or keeping people alive in Sudan amidst a famine, all of that is at risk.
So it has been 8 days of the Trump administration, and since the foreign aid freeze order, have there been any immediate impacts that you've seen thus far, other than, of course, people getting laid off, in terms of like programs not doing what they're intending to do? Like, have you heard of anything happening like in the here and now? I know there'll be long term, and we'll discuss it at length in a second. But what's happening today?
Yeah, there have absolutely been. Sorry, I had a call coming in. Since we're doing this on my phone, I just need to dismiss that. Yeah, no, there have absolutely been immediate impacts. So where we saw those manifest most immediately were in some of the ongoing life-saving programs in the humanitarian sector and in global health. Now, in the humanitarian sector, there was a waiver that came from Secretary Rubio, issued very late yesterday. It still remains to be seen how that's going to translate into practical effect, if they're going to pull back all the stop work letters. To my understanding, they have not pulled those all back yet for the humanitarian partners, but maybe that will get fixed. So caveat that way. But we absolutely began to see this in humanitarian and global health programs almost immediately. So programs were being pulled out of refugee camps. Assistance was being pulled out of refugee camps. There were instructions going out to partners that operate US-funded HIV clinics in many countries that they could no longer distribute antiretroviral drugs. Now, to put that in perspective, on any given day, more than 200,000 people are showing up to a US-funded HIV clinic somewhere in the world to get their next round of antiretroviral doses so that they can keep their infection suppressed. Yesterday, those people were being turned away in many places. So, that there are practical, real-world effects that began showing up almost immediately that were harmful to people.
And it's just like worth pointing out what happens when someone who is on antiretroviral treatment goes off of it, which is that their viral load suddenly increases, and potentially get resistance to existing antiretrovirals, potentially unleashing resistant strains of HIV. And this has the potential to reverse just tremendous progress that's been made against HIV. And again, in my view, it's horribly myopic to think that the consequences of those actions will remain in, say, Tanzania or South Africa, not spread globally. But that's maybe a conversation for another day. So we're seeing these immediate impacts, and the freeze is ostensibly for 90 days, but who knows what will happen in those 90 days or after those 90 days. Like, big picture, you have been in the foreign aid, international development, humanitarian relief world for a very long time. It's your career. We've turned to you on this show many times to help us make sense of it all. What are some of the foreseeable outcomes that you predict would result from a U.S. freeze on aid?
Yeah. Well, start at the human level. As we've been talking about, if PEPFAR were to just stop working for 3 months, you would see a new surge in HIV transmission in much of the world. PEPFAR plays a huge role in keeping HIV suppressed and keeping the epidemic at or near epidemic control in many, many countries. If you take that away, there will be a rebound in the global AIDS epidemic, and that will harm a lot of people. It'll harm a lot of countries, and ultimately, that's harmful to the United States. It poses health and economic risks to us as well if there is a rebound in the global HIV epidemic. We will see crises worsen. So there is a famine right now in Sudan. If the famine aid is hampered in Sudan, that famine will worsen and yet more people will die. It potentially risks the ceasefire in Gaza if aid to Gaza is being halted and can't be effectively distributed. Of course, humanitarian access was a core part of the bargain that underpinned the ceasefire. If you take that away, that raises the risks that the ceasefire collapses. So there are all sorts of in a human level impacts there that will just harm people in real time. But also geostrategically, it's a huge, huge blunder. There is particularly in the minds of a lot of the Trump administration officials, they really see the U.S. being in a geostrategic competition with China. Uh, and this is a bit like unilateral disarmament in that competition, because one of the major ways that the US uh, builds relationships, shows its values in the world, and differentiates those values from the values of how China engages is through our foreign aid programs. If those are all shut down, we don't only lose a sort of competitive tool in our toolkit, we also just make ourselves look really silly and unreliable. And I would imagine that the prospect of this has a lot of Chinese embassies in a lot of parts of the world pretty excited, because if the U.S. removes itself from the equation as a player in the development dialogue in those countries, and countries where development and economic development are huge factors in their national policy and their national priorities, if we're off the board, who are they going to turn to? They will turn yet more heavily towards China. So now I am not personally a huge China hawk on that kind of thing. And I want to see countries develop in general. I would love to see China step up more. They don't carry enough of their burden in like the humanitarian world and the development world. But boy, we would be just handing much more of the board to them if the U.S. withdraws, and even if we shut down for 3 months, all the program breakage that goes along with that just makes us look like a deeply unreliable partner. Someone turning up at an HIV clinic to get their next round of drugs and being turned away does not signal much U.S. reliability.
So you mentioned Gaza and you mentioned Sudan, two massive humanitarian crises. We now have an escalating crisis as well in the Democratic Republic of Congo,
Yes.
just
Yes.
adding to like a global burden of humanitarian crises that have been expanding over the last several years as a consequence of climate change and more conflict for a combination of reasons. Humanitarian needs over the last several years have expanded sharply. At the same time, funding to meet those needs has not risen commensurate.
Yes. That's right.
Um, Here we have sharply rising humanitarian needs at a time when traditionally one of, if not the top humanitarian donor to humanitarian relief, to the UN Refugee Agency, to the World Food Program, to
Yeah.
UNICEF, to all these NGOs, is suddenly, pulling its cards and leaving. Like, what happens to the global humanitarian system? Can it be sustained?
I think there's a real risk of collapse of the global humanitarian system if U.S. funding is pulled back. Um, you know, the U.S. provides in an average year about 40%, give or take, of global humanitarian financing. So that's not the majority, but it is the largest single share. And look, we're the richest country in the world. We are a global leader. We should do that.
And it's not like a huge amount of money in budgetary terms.
It's also let's be clear. We're not talking about a huge amount of money. We're talking about things that would be a rounding error upon a rounding error of the military budget. U.S. humanitarian spending in recent years has been in the ballpark of about $10 billion. So it's not nothing, um, but it is even within the overall foreign assistance budget, it is a fraction. Um, so we're not talking about a huge amount of money. I mean, one analogy that a friend of mine um, in the field once liked to use was the world spends less on humanitarian response than it does on bubblegum. And if you Google that, that's actually right. So I would think that the U.S. could spend our annual bubblegum budget on preventing starvation and addressing crises around the world. It's not a huge amount of money, but to the global humanitarian system, it's fundamentally important. And so if you pull out that financial backbone, the rest of the body is going to collapse. Without the funding that the U.S. puts in, it would have terrible effects not just on our own, the programs that we fund ourselves. It would have kind of cascading financial effects on the rest of the system because it would just remove so many of the critical components that the U.S. has long funded.
So, can I ask you maybe one last question about how we got here
Yeah.
in the American political context? So, like when I started my career 20 years ago, there was some bipartisan, there's like a few areas where there was always bipartisan consensus, like Israel was one, and global health was another.
Yeah.
Global health has always been an area of broad bipartisan consensus. Now, there are some differences, like Republicans didn't like to fund reproductive health. It got caught up in abortion politics here in the United States. But by and large, when it came to global health, there was this idea that it is a global good that also benefits American security interests.
Yeah.
How is it that this spending became, partisanized? Like, how did we get to this point?
Yeah. Yeah, and really, even during the first Trump administration, you saw that bipartisan support continue.
Yeah.
When Trump came in 2017, one of the first things that his OMB did was propose sweeping cuts to the foreign affairs budget, and Republicans like Lindsey Graham, Mitch McConnell, Jeff Flake, John McCain stood up for that budget, and it was not significantly cut. Because they recognize the value of that. I do think for a lot of Republicans of that generation, the experience of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan was really instructive. In the late '90s, Republicans in Congress led by oh shoot, Jesse Helms.
Just I'm gonna say Jesse. I know you're going.
Remember Jesse Helms?
You're
Led
gonna
by Jesse Helms, pushed the Clinton administration to make sweeping, huge cuts at USAID. And it dramatically weakened the agency. It dramatically weakened the US's ability to manage and implement effective foreign aid programs. And no one much cared until we then needed to try and rebuild Iraq and Afghanistan after the wars there, and did not have the capacity in the government to mount the sort of programs and operations that were needed. And so that, interestingly, George Bush came in not particularly a fan of foreign aid, and it really turned him and many of the Republicans around because they saw, no, actually, we do have an interest in having a strong foreign aid apparatus. Now, I wish it didn't take wars for people to have that recognition, but okay, I'm glad that recognition at least arrived. Many of those people who went through that, who saw the importance of having a strong USAID, who were invested in rebuilding USAID, which then happened quite successfully over the next 10 years, they're not in Congress anymore.
Yeah.
And so I think it's partly that. I think it's partly reflective of just the larger kind of partisan polarization that we've seen in the country. And frankly, there's a lot of bad faith gaslighting out there in media and social media about foreign aid. I mean, to listen to some right-wing commentators talk about it, you would think that foreign aid was the main reason that we have a budget deficit.
Yeah.
In reality, total foreign aid spending is less than 1% of the federal budget. So, if we have a huge budget deficit, and the only thing or the main thing you're pointing to as the way to combat that is foreign aid, then you've basically already given up. The reality is that foreign aid really doesn't have any material impact on the deficit relative to the overall size of the budget. And for that, we do a tremendous amount of good in the world and save ourselves a tremendous amount of headache. One just quick example of that: when I was at USAID in the Obama administration, I worked on the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. And because at that point, the World Health Organization was pretty weak on emergency response. The US had to do a lot to get that contained. We spent several $billions. We deployed our military. We then worked to build WHO into a stronger partner. And we were quite supportive and quite tough on them to build in kind of pushing them to build out an emergency capacity, which they did very effectively. And 5 years later, another sizable Ebola outbreak in Africa, this time in the war zone areas of Eastern Congo. The US didn't have to deploy the military. We spent far less money. We deployed far fewer people because WHO by that point had real capacity backstopped by us to respond directly, and it saved the US government a lot of money and a lot of effort. So, there are returns in terms of the good we do, and there are returns in terms of the things we also don't have to do when we have strong partners in the global aid space.
Let's take a question from the audience if there are any. And as people are thinking of their questions, let me just wrap up with one question for you. We're 8 days into the administration, a lot is happening. What indicators will you be looking towards that will suggest to you whether or not this aid freeze is like a blip, or whether or not it in fact is here to stay?
So I think the duration of the freeze is going to be really, really key. A 3 month pause in funding and a 3 month pause in operations will challenge the financial solvency of a lot of U.S. partner organizations. There are some NGOs that could survive having their largest source of funding turned off for 3 months, but there are a lot that can't. And so they are going to start to do really irreversible damage to the sector if they don't pull back this freeze or greatly curtail it in the pretty near term. I'm encouraged that we saw the humanitarian exemption yesterday. I think we need to see a lot more exemption. Well, frankly, we need to see this whole thing pulled back and rethought. But barring that, they need to be pulling back the freeze on a lot of global health spending, and they need to be doing this in a way that it does not undermine the financial viability of the many, many, hundreds and hundreds of partner organizations of USAID over this potential 3 month period. So I think that's a really important thing to watch. I'll be very interested to see which programs do they actually target and cut. Is it really just ones where they disagree with some of what they see as the identity politics of those operations, or are they cutting things more broadly? There are rumors and a lot of concern swirling that this is a stalking horse for folding USAID into the State Department. There's a lot of rumors flying on that actually just today. That will be a really important thing to watch too. We saw that movie in the UK over the past few years when DFID was stood down as an independent agency and folded into the new Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. And frankly, it has turned the UK into a much weaker player on the global aid stage. And so I think if they did that, they would greatly diminish the US's ability to project influence and to do good in the world through our foreign aid apparatus. So that structural question is an important thing to watch. And the fundamental thing we need to watch is how much harm is this doing? Because it is already doing harm to people who depend on and rely on and have long believed they could count on support from the United States government.
Mhm.
And if that's pulled back, it's going to harm a lot of people and it's going to harm the US's standing in the world.
So very briefly, a question from a live stream audience, Monty McMurtry. What does this aid cut suggest to you about how Marco Rubio will approach his job as Secretary of State?
Well, it's a really key piece to watch as well, and a really key question. Rubio as a senator was always hugely supportive of a lot of these programs. He was a vocal supporter of PEPFAR. He was very good on food aid. In his hearing, he talked with, I think, a lot of passion about the humanitarian crisis in Sudan and the need for the U.S. to provide leadership there. So it's a real question to me, how much of this is his agenda? How much of these really draconian moves are being pushed by some of the day one appointees who may or may not actually be aligned with the secretary on his vision, and ultimately which vision prevails?
Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for your time. I know you've been a hot commodity in the media these last few days, so I appreciate you taking a moment to speak with me and share your insights with the audience.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
minutes. And